Julius Caesar is sailing up the Nile in 46 BC. He is one of the most educated men in the Roman world. He has studied Greece, Persia, Carthage. He knows civilizations. And as his boat passes the pyramids at Giza, he is looking at structures that are already 1,500 years old. Those pyramids are more ancient to Caesar than Caesar is to us. By the time Caesar sees them, Egypt has already collapsed twice, been occupied by foreign rulers, rebuilt itself from nothing, and is now on its final ruler. A 23-year-old woman named Cleopatra. Egypt did not last for centuries. It lasted for 3,000 years, longer than the gap between the fall of Rome and today. By the end of this video, you will understand how that was possible. Not a list of pharaohs, not a string of dates. The actual logic of how a civilization survives 3 millennia and what it looks like when it finally runs out. Those pyramids were already ancient when Jesus was born. Egypt exists because of one thing. The Nile floods every year on a predictable schedule. It deposits a thin layer of rich silt across a narrow strip of land, then recedes. The land on either side of that strip is desert. Without the flood, there is no food. Without the food, there is no city. This is not a detail about Egypt's geography. It is the entire explanation for why civilization was possible here at all. The Nile also created a geography that almost no other civilization had. A long, narrow corridor with desert on both sides, the Mediterranean to the north, and a series of unnavigable rapids to the south called cataracts. Egypt was difficult to attack from almost any direction. By 3100 BC, 2 separate kingdoms had grown up along the river, one in the south and one in the north. A king named Narmer unified them. That unification is the starting gun. Almost everything Egypt built afterward. Centralized government, professional administration, organized religion as a tool of political control, monumental construction as state propaganda, became the template that every empire after it borrowed from, including Rome. The Nile made Egypt possible. But there was one thing the Nile also made inevitable, and it is the reason Egypt collapsed the first time. After unification, Egypt's rulers quickly discovered that the flood needed to be managed. The water had to be stored, redirected, rationed. Crops had to be tracked and distributed. That kind of system requires administrators. It requires scribes and surveyors and grain accountants. The Egyptian state did not grow out of military conquest. It grew out of the practical necessity of organizing water. The pharaoh sat at the top of this system, but not as a powerful king in the way we might think of a king. The pharaoh was a god. Specifically, he was the god Horus made flesh. This was not metaphor. It was the operating system of the entire state. Because the pharaoh was divine, his orders were not political decisions. They were cosmic law. Disobedience was not rebellion. It was chaos against the natural order of the universe. That framing gave the state an authority no military force alone could have provided. Around 2560 BC, a pharaoh named Khufu directed the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks. The largest individual blocks weigh around 80 tons. The whole structure was built without wheeled vehicles, without iron tools, without any machinery beyond human muscle, copper chisels, wooden sledges, and rope. Archaeologists estimate the workforce at somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 people. Those workers were not slaves. We know this because they left evidence. Excavations near Giza have found workers' villages complete with bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities. Tomb inscriptions record what appear to be payroll documents. The pyramid builders had organized housing, food rations, and their own burial sites adjacent to the pharaoh's complex. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote about Egyptian slaves building the pyramids, but Herodotus was writing more than 2,000 years after the pyramids were built. The actual archaeological record tells a different story. The Old Kingdom produced the Great Pyramid, the most ambitious construction project in human history up to that point. It also produced the conditions that would destroy the state within 200 years. Those two things are connected. Here is the mechanism. To build the pyramid and maintain the temples and keep the administrators loyal, pharaohs granted land and tax exemptions to nobles and priests. That was the currency of loyalty. Over generations, those grants accumulated. By the end of the Old Kingdom, the central government had given away so much land and exempted so much income that it no longer had the revenue to function. The state was not defeated in battle. It was not struck by a natural disaster. It hollowed out from inside. Around 2181 BC, central authority collapsed. The question was, who actually controlled Egypt now, and who was going to rebuild it? The answer was nobody, not for a long time. Egypt fractured into competing regional territories. Local governors called nomarchs ran their own land, collected their own taxes, fielded their own soldiers. Some historians argue that a prolonged drought beginning around 2200 BC may have reduced Nile flooding and accelerated the crisis by triggering famine across the country. The paleoclimate evidence for this drought exists, though the direct causal link to Egypt's political collapse is still debated. What is clear is that both problems arrived at roughly the same time, and the combination was catastrophic. The state that had built the pyramids simply stopped existing. Then, around 2055 BC, a ruler named Mentuhotep II from Thebes in southern Egypt did what strong provincial leaders would do again and again across Egyptian history. He raised an army, absorbed the fragments, and reunified the country. He reasserted divine kingship. He rebuilt the administrative system. The Middle Kingdom that followed was not just a political restoration. Egypt began producing literature, philosophy, texts that argued explicitly about what good governance meant. The Egyptians had experienced total collapse and come back from it, and they decided to write down what they had learned. Egypt is stable again. The bureaucracy functions. The pharaoh is once more a god. So how does a civilization this organized get conquered from the outside for the first time in its history? Egypt was conquered by people who had not invaded it. They had just moved in. The people the Egyptians called the Hyksos were migrants, most likely from the Levant, the region that is now roughly Israel, Palestine, and Syria. They did not arrive as an invading army with a battle plan. They settled in the Nile Delta in the north over generations, built communities, established trade networks, accumulated influence. And one day, around 1650 BC, they were simply in control of a large portion of northern Egypt. The takeover was gradual enough that there was no single moment of conquest to point to. What the Hyksos brought with them mattered. They had bronze weapons where Egypt used copper. They had the composite bow, which outranged anything Egypt fielded. And they had horse-drawn chariots, which were entirely new to Egypt. The military technology gap was decisive. For roughly 100 years, a foreign people controlled the most strategically important part of the country, the fertile northern delta, where the Nile meets the Mediterranean. Ramesses II is the most famous pharaoh in Egyptian history. He only exists because Egypt was humiliated 100 years before he was born. Around 1550 BC, a pharaoh from Thebes named Ahmose launched a military campaign and expelled the Hyksos from Egypt. Then he did something that would define the next 400 years. He kept the army mobilized. Instead of demobilizing after the expulsion, Ahmose used the army to push outward, south into Nubia, northeast into the Levant. Egypt, which had spent 3,000 years as a largely inward-looking civilization, became an empire. The new kingdom that followed is the Egypt most people recognize. Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh who sent trade expeditions deep into Africa. Tutankhamun, who died young and whose tomb was found almost completely intact in 1922. Ramesses II, who ruled for 66 years, built temples across the entire known world and signed what is considered the first formal peace treaty in recorded history with the Hittite Empire. This is the Egypt of the movies, the museums, the documentaries. Egypt at its most powerful and most visible. Around 1200 BC, something happened that destroyed every major civilization in the ancient world. Egypt was the only one that survived. We still do not fully know why. The Hittite Empire, which had been Ramesses II's treaty partner and Egypt's equal, collapsed completely around 1200 BC. Mycenaean Greece collapsed. Ugarit, one of the most important port cities in the ancient world on the coast of modern Syria, was burned to the ground and never rebuilt. City after city across the eastern Mediterranean shows the same archaeological signature at this time. Destruction layers, abandoned sites, trade networks that simply stop. The Egyptian records describe waves of attackers arriving by ship and on land simultaneously, peoples they called those from the sea. In 1177 BC, a pharaoh named Ramesses III repelled a massive coordinated attack and had the victory carved into the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu. The carvings still exist. Egypt survived the event that destroyed every other civilization on Earth. That survival almost broke it permanently. Ramesses III's victory did not stabilize Egypt. According to CT scans conducted on his mummy in 2012, he was later killed by a deep cut to the throat, most likely the result of a palace assassination plot. After his death, Egypt entered a long, slow decline. The historian Eric Klein, who has studied the Bronze Age collapse in depth, argues that what happened around 1200 BC was not a single invasion, but a systems failure. The civilizations of the eastern Mediterranean had become deeply interdependent. Copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, grain from Egypt, timber from Lebanon. When drought, famine, migration, trade disruption, and political instability all hit at roughly the same time, the interconnected system collapsed in a cascade. Egypt survived because it had the Nile. It was still food secure when its trading partners were starving. But surviving cost Egypt its imperial reach. Over the following centuries, Egypt would be conquered by the Assyrians, then by the Persians. Each time it recovered something, it never fully recovered itself. Egypt has survived 2,500 years of internal collapse, external invasion, and the destruction of every civilization around it. It is still here. The last pharaoh of Egypt is a Greek who had never been to Egypt before she was born there. Alexander the Great arrived in 332 BC. He did not need to fight much. The Egyptians had been under Persian rule for 2 centuries and resented it. Alexander presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He visited the oracle at the oasis of Siwa, which reportedly declared him the son of the god Amun. He built a new city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria, which would become the intellectual capital of the ancient world. When Alexander died in 323 BC, his generals divided the empire. Egypt went to a man named Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions, who founded the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemaic rulers were Macedonian Greeks. They spoke Greek at court. They founded Greek-style institutions. And they also built Egyptian temples, adopted Egyptian titles, presented themselves as the incarnations of Egyptian gods, and conducted the rituals that the priests expected of a pharaoh. Cleopatra VII, the last of them, was reportedly the first ruler of her 300-year dynasty to speak the Egyptian language. She was not Egyptian. She was a Macedonian Greek who had grown up in Egypt and learned to rule it from the inside. When Octavian, the future Roman Emperor Augustus, defeated her and Mark Antony in 30 BC, there was no battle for Egypt's soul. Octavian simply took possession of it as a Roman province. He did not install a new pharaoh. He managed Egypt directly as property. Rome did not burn Egypt. It kept Egypt exactly as it was. It just stopped letting Egyptians run it. The temples kept operating. The priests kept their positions. The old religious forms continued for another 4 centuries. What died was not Egyptian culture. What died was Egyptian political self-determination. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 AD at the Temple of Philae, a small island in the Nile near the southern border. It is a dedication to the goddess Isis. Within a generation of that carving, no living person could read it. The writing system that had recorded everything Egypt ever built, every law, every religious text, every king's claim to divine authority, became unreadable. Egypt's 3,000-year survival was not military strength. It was not geography alone, though geography helped. It was a system that was very good at one specific thing: collapsing, identifying the template it had built before, and rebuilding from that template. That happened twice in the first 2,000 years. The system survived the Bronze Age catastrophe that ended every other civilization around it. It survived foreign dynasties by absorbing them into its own form. What ended it was not destruction. It was a slow administrative transfer to a power that had no interest in letting the system regenerate on its own terms. In 1799, French soldiers in Napoleon's army found a stone slab near the town of Rosetta in the Nile Delta. The stone had the same text written in three scripts: Greek, which scholars could read, and two forms of Egyptian writing, which no one had been able to decipher for over 1,000 years. It took another 23 years to decode it. The text on the Rosetta Stone turned out to be a tax decree, a bureaucratic order about priestly exemptions. Egypt's last legible message to the future was paperwork. The pyramids are still there. The language that built them was unreadable for 400 years.